Hey guys, tonight we step into one of the most carefully guarded secrets in all of Westeros. The hidden truth behind Aegon the Conqueror and his 3 wives that changes everything we thought we knew about the Targaryen dynasty. This isn't just a story about political marriages or dragon riders. This is about ancient Valyrian blood magic, prophetic visions that spanned centuries, and a love so powerful it was designed to save the world from eternal winter. We're talking about Rhaenys Visenya and Aegon himself, bound together not just by marriage vows, but by mystical forces that most maesters tried to erase from history. 3 hearts beating as one, 3 dragons sharing the same dreams, and 3 souls sacrificing everything for a destiny. None of them fully understood until it was too late. So before you settle in for this journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving deep into these hidden mysteries with me, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our community from around the world come together for these late-night explorations. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable under your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It began with a vision that haunted all 3 of them. The same dream, night after night, century after century. Aegon would wake gasping, seeing endless fields of ice and death marching south. Rhaenys would bolt upright, her hands trembling as she sketched the same 3-headed dragon constellation that appeared in her sleep. And Visenya, warrior that she was, would reach for Dark Sister in the darkness, knowing somehow that steel alone would never be enough for what was coming. The Maesters want you to believe it was about conquest, about building an empire and securing power. But deep in the hidden chambers of Dragonstone, in texts written in High Valyrian that were meant to burn with Old Valyria itself, lies a different truth. A truth about why the Iron Throne had to be forged from 1,000 conquered swords, why it cut those who weren't worthy to sit upon it, and why 3 marriages were not just political necessity, but the only way to create a magical barrier against something far more terrifying than any human army. Tonight we uncover the real reason Aegon needed 3 wives, the secret that connects their love story to prophecies of ice and fire, and the hidden purpose behind everything the Targaryens built, forgot, and ultimately lost. The dragons remember, even when kings forget, and tonight, so will you. 300 years before the War of the 5 Kings would tear Westeros apart, when dragons still soared above castle towers and Valyrian steel was forged in dragonfire, there lived a keeper of forbidden knowledge in the depths of Dragonstone. His name was Maester Qyburne's predecessor, though history would forget him, as it forgot so many truths that were deemed too dangerous to remember. The ancient fortress of Dragonstone rose from the narrow sea like a great stone dragon itself, its towers carved into the likeness of worms, and its halls echoing with the whispers of old Valyria. Deep beneath the castle, far below the chambers where Aegon the Conqueror once planned his conquest of the 7 kingdoms, lay chambers that few had ever seen. These were the true archives of House Targaryen, where the most sacred and terrible secrets of dragonlords were kept in scrolls of dragonhide and books bound with scales that still gleamed with inner fire. The keeper moved through these shadowed halls like a man walking through his own dreams. His robes, gray as ash from Valyrian pyres, whispered against stone floors worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps. In his weathered hands he carried a single black candle, though it was not made of ordinary wax. This was dragon glass, obsidian carved and shaped by masters of the ancient arts, and its flame burned with a light that seemed to see into the very soul of things. For 40 years he had tended these archives, reading texts that would drive lesser minds to madness, caring for artifacts that hummed with barely contained power. He had seen the rise and fall of kings, watched as dragons danced their deadly dance above King's Landing, witnessed the slow decay of the blood of old Valyria, as each generation forgot a little more of what their ancestors had known. But tonight was different. Tonight something called to him from the deepest vaults, something that had been waiting 3 centuries to be understood. The salt air of Blackwater Bay crept through the ancient stones, carrying with it the memory of distant Valyria and the smoke of funeral pyres. Even now, so many years after the doom, the very walls of Dragonstone seemed to remember their origins. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night, you could still hear it, the sound of the 14 flames erupting in harmony, the crack of whips as dragons were bound to riders, the chanting of blood mages as they worked their terrible arts. But there were other sounds too, if you knew how to listen. The rustle of parchment as ancient hands traced out prophecies in High Valyrian. The scratch of quills recording dreams that came not from sleep, but from the shared consciousness of dragons. The whispered conversations of 3 voices, speaking of love and duty and sacrifice in equal measure. It was then that he found her, kneeling in the chapel of remembrance where the ashes of Targaryen dead were kept in urns of black stone. Septa Eliana was her name, though she served no ordinary sept and kept no ordinary faith. She was the keeper of the marriage records, the one who knew which vows were spoken in sight of gods and which were sworn in sight of dragons. Her face was ageless in the way of those who had looked too long into fires that burned with more than mere flame, and her eyes held the silver glint of old Valyrian blood. She did not look up as he approached, but her voice carried clearly in the stillness. You feel it too, don't you? The stirring in the stones, the whisper in the wind, something that has slept for 300 years begins to wake. Her fingers traced the carved names on the nearest urn, names in High Valyrian that spoke of dragon lords and their ladies, of marriages that bound not just houses but bloodlines to purposes greater than themselves. I've been reading the old contracts again, she continued, her voice soft as silk but sharp as Valyrian steel. The ones written in the old tongue, sealed with more than wax and ribbon. There are things there that make no sense unless what the histories tell us is only half the truth, he finished for her. Unless the conqueror's 3 wives were more than queens, more than riders of dragons, more than the mothers of kings. Before either could speak again, footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Heavy boots on ancient stone, the measured tread of a knight making his rounds. But this was no ordinary guard. Sir Daemon Waters entered the chapel with the easy grace of a man born to sword and saddle, though the shadow of illegitimate birth hung about him like a cloak. His dark hair marked him as one of the river lords, but his eyes held flecks of violet that spoke of older bloodlines, royal blood that had flowed in bastard streams for generations untold. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though his tone suggested he had expected to find them here. "But there are things stirring in the city tonight. Dreams, the small folk call them, though they come to waking minds as well as sleeping ones. Dreams of dragons flying in formation against stars that shine too bright, of crowns that weigh more than gold and iron should weigh." The keeper studied the knight's face in the candlelight. Here was another who had been called, another whose blood sang with half-remembered songs of old Valyria. "What have you seen, Sir Daemon?" "The same thing every night for a moon's turn. Now, 3 figures standing on a tower that touches the clouds, looking out over lands that stretch beyond the horizon. A woman in armor that shines like silver flame, a woman in robes that shift like living shadow, and between them a man who bears a crown that burns without consuming. They speak in a language I should not understand, yet every word is clear as mountain water." The Septa's breath caught, and her hand moved instinctively to a scroll case at her belt. "The prophecies," she whispered. "The ones that were sealed away because they spoke of things that had not yet come to pass. 3 heads has the dragon, and 3 fires must burn as one." The keeper felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak woven from the very fabric of time itself. For centuries, scholars had wondered why Aegon the Conqueror had taken 2 wives when one would have served for alliance and heir. For centuries, they had debated the politics of marriage and the strategy of dragons. But what if the answer lay not in the minds of men, but in the dreams of dragons? What if love and prophecy were not opposing forces, but 2 faces of the same eternal truth? "Then we begin tonight," he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. "We seek the truth that lies beneath the truth, the story that was hidden so well that even those who lived it forgot its true meaning." The dragon glass candle flickered, and for just a moment, the 3 of them could swear they heard the distant sound of wings beating against an endless sky. The descent into the deeper archives began at the hour when night was darkest, when even the guards had grown weary and the castle above them slept in the embrace of ancient dreams. The keeper led them through passages that few living souls had ever walked, down stairs carved from the living rock of Dragonstone itself. Each step took them further from the world of men and closer to the realm where dragons had once held dominion over more than sky and flame. The walls here were different than those above. Where the upper halls bore the carved likenesses of dragons in flight, these depths showed older things, symbols that predated even the founding of Valyria, runes that spoke of the first compact between dragon lords and their mighty steeds. The very air thrummed with power barely contained, and more than once Sir Daemon's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, though no earthly blade could defend against what dwelt in these shadows. "Here," the keeper said, stopping before a door that seemed to be carved from a single piece of black stone. No lock secured it, no key was needed. Instead, ancient words had to be spoken, words in the old tongue that carried the weight of binding oaths and solemn vows. As the syllables fell from his lips, the stone seemed to sigh, and the door swung open to reveal a chamber that took their breath away. The Hall of Whispers stretched before them, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to move and breathe with a life of its own. Along the walls stood pedestals of carved dragon bone, and upon each rested artifacts that told the story of the Targaryen dynasty in ways no maester's chronicle ever could. Here was the crown Aegon had worn when he first set foot on Westerosi soil, still bearing the dents where enemy swords had struck it. There was the marriage cup from which all 3 of his wives had drunk on their wedding day, its surface etched with runes that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at them. But it was the center of the chamber that drew their attention like iron filings to a lodgestone. 3 thrones stood there, not the iron throne that would later be forged from conquered swords, but the original seats of power from old Valyria itself. They were carved from what looked like dragon bone, though no dragon that had ever lived could have provided bones of such size and purity. Each throne was different, yet they were clearly made to complement each other, like parts of a greater whole. Septa Ileana approached the nearest throne with reverence that bordered on fear. "I've read about these in the oldest texts," she whispered. "The throne of swords for the warrior, the throne of scrolls for the wise, and the throne of hearts for the one who would unite them all. But I never believed they truly existed." The keeper moved to stand before the central throne, and as he did, the chamber filled with a sound like distant thunder. "They existed," he said, his voice carrying strange harmonics in the charged air. "And they were brought to Dragonstone for a purpose that went far beyond mere ceremony. Touch the arm of the warrior's throne, Septa. Let the stone remember what flesh has forgotten." She hesitated for only a moment before placing her palm against the carved armrest. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and when she spoke it was not in her own voice but in the tones of someone long dead. "I am steel made flesh," came the words, and they all knew they were hearing the voice of Visenya Targaryen herself. "I am the sword that guards the sleepers, the shield that stands against the darkness that will come." My marriage is not to a man but to a destiny written in fire and blood. The vision lasted only moments, but when it ended, the scepter staggered back with tears streaming down her face. She knew, she gasped. Virginia knew what was coming. She saw the ice and the death, the army of the dead that would march from the far north. The marriage wasn't about love or politics. It was about creating a weapon that could stand against the long night. Sir Damon had moved to the second throne while the scepter recovered from her vision. When he touched it, his reaction was different but no less profound. Where she had channeled the voice of the dead, he seemed to see into the realm of dreams made manifest. "The books," he said in wonder, though his eyes were fixed on empty air. "Rhaenys is showing me the books, scrolls and tomes and charts that map the movement of magic itself across the world. She knew the cycles, knew when the ice would wake and when the fire would be needed to drive it back. Every star chart, every prophecy, every dream of dragons was part of a greater pattern." The keeper watched them both with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. 40 years of study had not prepared him for this moment, for the revelation that the Targaryen conquest had been not the beginning of their story, but merely one chapter in a tale that stretched back to the very foundations of the world. "And what of the third throne?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would change everything they thought they understood about the nature of love and power. Sir Damon straightened, his vision fading like morning mist. "That one is not for us to touch," he said, with certainty that brooked no argument. "That one waits for the true heir, the one who will come when the wheel turns full circle and the choices made 300 years ago finally bear their fruit." Above them, in the chambers where tourists now walked and lords held court, a wind began to blow that carried with it the scent of winter roses and the sound of silver bells. Somewhere in the distance, a dragon that had been dead for centuries seemed to roar its approval. The quest for truth had begun in earnest, and already the very stones of Dragonstone were whispering secrets that would reshape the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The deeper they ventured into the mysteries of Dragonstone, the more the very foundations of accepted history began to crumble like ancient parchment touched by flame. In a vault that required 3 keys to open, each held by a different bloodline for 3 centuries, they found the marriage contracts that had bound Aegon to his sister wives. But these were not the copies that scholars had studied for generations. These were the originals, written in High Valyrian script so old that the very letters seemed to writhe and dance upon the dragon-skin parchment. Septa Ileana held the first contract, with hands that trembled, not with age, but with the weight of revelation. "Look at the wording," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the vault. "This is not a marriage between a man and a woman. This is a binding between flame and flesh, between mortal will and eternal purpose." The words were indeed strange, speaking not of love and honor, as marriage vows should, but of sacrifice and service to something greater than themselves. The contract between Aegon and Visenya spoke of the warrior's burden and the price of the sword. That between Aegon and Rhaenys mentioned the keeper of ancient wisdom and the guardian of tomorrow's dreams. Most disturbing of all, both contracts were sealed not with the traditional mixture of wax and blood, but with something that glowed with its own inner light, even after 3 centuries. "Dragon's blood," the keeper said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "But not the blood of any dragon that ever lived. This is the blood of the great worms of old Valyria, the ones that were said to be as much spirit as flesh, as much magic as muscle and bone." Sir Damon had been examining the broken dragon egg that rested in a place of honor among the artifacts. Unlike the stone eggs that decorated the halls above, this one had clearly once held life. Cracks ran through its surface in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the egg had been opened from within by something that was not quite ready to be born. "There are 3 distinct magical signatures here," he said, running his fingers along the fracture lines. "Each one different, each one carrying the essence of a different kind of power. Fire, yes, but also shadow and dream, earth and water and wind. This egg was meant to hatch something that was more than dragon, something that could bridge the gap between the mortal world and the realm of pure magic. As if summoned by his words, the chamber filled with a sound like distant singing, harmonies that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. The keeper recognized the melody from the oldest songs of old Valyria, lullabies that dragon lords had sung to their children in the time before the doom. But these voices were not human. They carried the timbre of creatures that had never known the limits of flesh, beings of pure fire and will that had chosen to bind themselves to mortal forms for purposes that transcended individual desire. They shared dreams, Scepter, Ileana said suddenly, her eyes wide with understanding. All three of them, and their dragons too. Every night they walked in the same dreamscape, saw the same visions of what was to come. That's why the marriage contracts speak of binding souls rather than joining houses. They weren't just husband and wives, they were parts of the same greater being, fragments of a god scattered across mortal frames. The keeper moved to a crystal orb that sat upon a pedestal of carved obsidian. Within its depths, images swirled like smoke given form and substance. As he gazed into it, the images resolved into scenes that should have been impossible. Three figures stood upon a tower that existed in no earthly realm, looking out over a landscape that stretched from the icy wastes beyond the wall to the burning sands of dawn. But this was not the Westeros of their time. This was a land covered in ice and darkness, where the dead walked and the living huddled around fires that burned with desperate flame. The orb shows what was, what is, and what might yet be, he said, his voice thick with wonder and fear. And what it shows is that the long night was not a single event in the distant past. It is a cycle, a wheel that turns with the ages, and every time it turns, the world needs champions who can stand against the darkness. The visions in the orb shifted, showing the three marriages not as political alliances but as ritualistic bindings designed to create those champions. Aegon was not just a conqueror but a conduit, a mortal vessel through which the power of dragons could flow into the world. Visenya was not just a warrior but a guardian, her strength drawn from the very foundations of the earth. Rhaenys was not just a diplomat but a prophet, her wisdom gleaned from dreams that touched the edges of eternity. But why three? Sir Daemon asked, voicing the question that had haunted scholars for centuries. Why not one perfect union, one ultimate champion? The answer came not from any of them but from the walls themselves, as if the very stones of Dragonstone were speaking. Because no single mortal frame could contain the power needed to stand against the ultimate darkness. Because the magic of ice draws its strength from unity, from the merging of individual will into collective purpose. The only way to defeat it is with fire that burns in three distinct forms, three flames that complement rather than compete with each other. As the voice faded, they found themselves looking at each other with new understanding. The Targaryen dynasty had not been built on the ambition of a single man, but on the sacrifice of three souls who had willingly bound themselves to a destiny that would span generations. Every king who had sat the Iron Throne since had been carrying the weight of that original binding, whether they knew it or not. "There's something else," Scepter, Ileana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The contracts speak of payment, of a price that must be paid for the power they were given. But the price is not named, only described as the weight of crowns and the sorrow of dragons." The keeper felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the vault. Around them, the magical artifacts seemed to pulse with darker energy, as if responding to the mention of payment and price. Whatever power the three marriages had unleashed, it had not come without cost, and that cost was still being paid, generation after generation, in ways that none of them yet understood. Above them, The wind that had been building throughout the night reached a crescendo, and for a moment they could swear they heard the sound of dragon wings beating against the storm. Something was stirring in the depths of Dragonstone, something that had been sleeping for 3 centuries and was now beginning to wake. As dawn broke over Blackwater Bay, painting the ancient stones of Dragonstone in shades of gold and crimson, the 3 seekers of truth found themselves in the Chamber of Mirrors, a hall that few had ever entered, and fewer still had left unchanged. The chamber earned its name not from glass and silver, but from walls of polished dragonstone that reflected not your appearance, but your deepest thoughts and hidden desires. Here, surrounded by their own reflections multiplied into infinity, they began to piece together what they believed was the truth behind Aegon's 3 marriages. The keeper spread the ancient documents across a table of carved obsidian, each parchment crackling with age and power. In the growing light, the High Valyrian script seemed more comprehensible, the archaic symbols resolving into words that painted a picture of political necessity wrapped in the language of mysticism and prophecy. "Consider the evidence before us," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent in scholarly pursuit. Aegon landed on Westerosi shores with 3 dragons and a force barely 3,000 strong. Against him stood kingdoms with armies 10 times that size, fortresses that had never fallen, and alliances forged over centuries of intermarriage and shared blood. Septa Ileana nodded, her fingers tracing the genealogical charts that showed the complex web of noble bloodlines stretching across the 7 kingdoms. The Aryans controlled the Vale and its mountain passes, routes that any conqueror would need to secure. The Martells held Dorne, with its desert fortresses and guerrilla tactics that had humbled even the dragons, and between them lay a dozen other houses, each with their own strengths and ancient grudges. Sir Daemon had been studying the marriage contracts with the eye of a soldier rather than a scholar, looking for the practical considerations that might drive a conqueror's choices. "Look at the timing," he said, pointing to the dates inscribed in flowing script. Aegon married Visenya first, within days of landing at the mouth of the Blackwater. That gave him immediate legitimacy in the eyes of the Valyrian settlers who had been scattered across Westeros for generations. Old blood recognizing older blood. The logic seemed sound, almost comforting in its mundane simplicity. Here was no great mystical conspiracy but merely the calculated moves of a brilliant military mind, someone who understood that conquest required more than dragons and fire. It required the subtle art of alliance building, the careful weaving of bloodlines and loyalties that would bind the conquered lands together under a single crown. "And Rhaenys," the keeper continued, warming to the theory that seemed to explain so much. "Her marriage brought the wisdom of the ancient bloodlines, the knowledge of Valyrian customs and laws that would be needed to govern a realm carved from 7 kingdoms. She was not just a wife but a counselor, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of noble politics while Aegon focused on the larger strategy of conquest." The Chamber of Mirrors reflected their growing confidence, showing them images of themselves as great detectives unraveling a mystery that had confounded scholars for centuries. In the polished walls, they saw themselves presenting their findings to the Citadel, revolutionizing the understanding of Targaryen history with their careful analysis and rigorous scholarship. But even as they congratulated themselves on their deductive powers, something nagged at the edges of their consciousness, like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh. The magical artifacts around them seemed to pulse with a different rhythm now, not the harmony they had felt before, but something more discordant, as if the very stones of Dragonstone were trying to tell them that their neat theories were missing something vital. Septa Ileana was the first to voice the doubts that were growing in all their minds. "If it was merely politics," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "then why the mystical language in the contracts? Why speak of binding souls and sharing dreams when simple oaths of alliance would have sufficed?" The keeper paused in his examination of a genealogical chart, his finger hovering over a name that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. "There are anomalies," he admitted reluctantly. references to shared bloodlines that make no sense if we consider only the known histories, mentions of the three who are ones, and the flame that burns in Trinity. Sir Damon had moved to one of the chamber's windows, looking out over the narrow sea toward the mainland, where Aegon's conquest had begun 3 centuries ago. In the morning light he could see fishing boats dotting the water, their sails bright against the dark waves. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that beneath their feet lay secrets that could reshape their understanding of the world itself. "I've been thinking about the dreams," he said, without turning from the window. "The visions we experienced when we touched the thrones. They felt too real, too immediate to be mere echoes of the past. It was as if we were actually there, actually seeing through the eyes of the dead." The reflection of his words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and suddenly the Chamber of Mirrors felt less like a place of revelation and more like a trap. The polished walls no longer showed them images of scholarly triumph, but something far more unsettling. In one reflection, the keeper saw himself as an old man, hunched over books that burned his eyes to read. In another, Septa Liliana appeared as she might have been centuries ago, wearing robes that marked her as a priestess of older, darker gods. And Sir Damon's reflection showed him not as the bastard knight he was, but as a dragon lord of old Valyria, his eyes burning with inner fire. "The artifacts," the keeper said suddenly, his voice tight with growing unease. "They're not just responding to our presence, they're trying to show us something, trying to correct our assumptions." As if summoned by his words, the broken dragon egg they had examined in the vault below began to glow with soft radiance that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. The cracks in its surface widened slightly, and from within came a sound like distant crying, the lament of something that had been born into a world that was not ready to receive it. Septa Liliana approached the egg with reverence bordering on terror. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The life that once stirred within this shell. It was not a dragon, as we understand them, not a creature of simple flesh and flame. It was something else, something that existed on the boundary between the world of matter and the realm of pure spirit." The keeper joined her, his scholarly instincts warring with a growing sense that they were standing on the edge of revelations that might be too dangerous to pursue. "The contracts speak of payment," he said, his voice barely audible. "What if the political marriage theory is wrong, not because it's inaccurate, but because it's incomplete? What if Aegon's 3 marriages served multiple purposes, operating on levels of reality that our simple mortal minds can barely comprehend?" Sir Damon turned from the window, his face grave with new understanding. "I've served in the royal court, watched the games that nobles play for power and position. But what we saw in those visions, what we felt when we touched the thrones, that was something beyond politics. That was the touch of destiny itself, the weight of choices that echo across centuries." The chamber around them seemed to breathe with anticipation, as if the very stones were waiting for them to abandon their comfortable theories and embrace the far more terrifying truth that lay hidden beneath layers of myth and legend. The morning light streaming through the windows had taken on a strange quality, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and revealing details in the ancient carvings that had not been visible before. "Look at the walls," Septa Liliana said, her voice filled with wonder and dread in equal measure. "The carvings are changing, showing us scenes that were hidden when we first entered." Indeed, the elaborate dragon motifs that decorated the Chamber of Mirrors were shifting like living things, their stone coils unwinding to reveal images of 3 figures standing in a circle of fire. The figures were clearly Aegon and his sister wives, but they were not as history remembered them. Here they appeared as beings of power and majesty that transcended mere mortality, their forms flickering between human flesh and something far more elemental. The keeper felt his carefully constructed theory crumbling like a sand castle before the tide. "We've been thinking like scholars," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. analyzing documents and artifacts as if they were mere historical curiosities. But what if they're not just records of the past? What if they're active participants in an ongoing story, one that began long before Aegon's conquest and will continue long after we are dust? The broken dragon egg pulsed with brighter light, and for a moment they could swear they heard the sound of three voices singing in harmony, a melody that spoke of love and loss, of sacrifice and redemption, of choices made in the full knowledge of their terrible cost. The song seemed to come from the egg itself, as if the life that had once stirred within was trying to communicate across the centuries, to warn them that their search for truth would lead them into realms where mortal understanding failed and only faith could light the way. As the song faded, leaving behind only the sound of their own breathing and the distant crash of waves against the shore, they realized that their quest for the truth behind Aegon's 3 marriages had only just begun. The political theory they had constructed was not wrong, but it was merely the surface of something far deeper and more profound. Beneath the careful strategies and calculated alliances lay a story of mythic proportions, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of love, power, and destiny itself. The Chamber of Mirrors fell silent around them, but the silence was not empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of secrets yet to be revealed, and in that silence, they could feel the presence of something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting 3 centuries for the right people to ask the right questions and follow the answers wherever they might lead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ancient halls of Dragonstone as the 3 seekers descended deeper into the fortress than any living soul had ventured in generations. Beyond the Chamber of Mirrors lay passages that seemed to have been carved not by human hands, but by the very dragons themselves, their walls smooth and curved like the inside of some great shell. The air here was different, thick with power and heavy with the weight of centuries, carrying scents that spoke of distant lands and forgotten magics. Septa Ileana led the way, her intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden ways guiding them through turns and passages that existed on no map. In her hands she carried an ancient key, its surface covered in runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The key had been passed down through generations of Septas who served the Targaryens, though few had ever known its true purpose or the doors it was meant to open. "The Vault of Echoes," she said, as they approached a door that seemed to be made of living shadow, its surface rippling like black water. "The Septas who came before me spoke of it only in whispers, and only to those who had proven themselves worthy of the deepest truths. It is said that within its walls, the very stones remember every word spoken by dragon lords, every oath sworn in the sight of flames." The keeper studied the door with eyes that had seen many wonders, but none quite like this. The shadow stuff that composed it was not mere absence of light, but something far more substantial, a darkness that had weight and presence and seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. "How do we enter?" he asked. "What ritual opens such a door?" "Not ritual," Septa Ileana replied, her voice barely audible in the strange acoustics of the passage. "Truth. The door opens only for those who seek knowledge, not for its own sake, but in service of something greater than themselves." As she spoke the words, the key in her hands began to glow with soft silver light, and the shadowed door responded by slowly dissolving, revealing a chamber beyond that defied all logic and reason. The Vault of Echoes was vast beyond measure, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to stretch to infinity. But it was not empty darkness. It was filled with whispers, countless voices speaking in languages both familiar and strange, their words weaving together into a tapestry of sound that told the history of old Valyria and all who had carried its blood into the wider world. Sir Daemon stepped into the chamber with the wariness of a soldier entering unknown territory, his hand resting instinctively on his sword hilt, though he knew no earthly weapon would serve him here. The floor beneath his feet was made of polished obsidian, and with each step, ripples of light spread outward, like stones thrown into still water. In those ripples, images appeared and vanished, showing glimpses of the past that no living eye had witnessed. By the 7 he breathed, though the oath felt strangely hollow in this place where older gods held sway. I can see them, the dragon lords in their glory, before the doom came to claim them all. Indeed, the chamber was filled with the ghosts of memory, translucent figures that moved through their eternal routines with the stately grace of those born to command both dragons and men. Here a lord in robes of silver and gold consulted charts that mapped the currents of magic itself. There a lady sang lullabies to eggs that pulsed within a fire, her voice weaving spells of protection and binding that would endure for centuries. And everywhere the great dragons themselves, their forms shifting between flesh and spirit as they communed with riders who were more than mere mortals. The keeper found himself drawn to a section of the chamber where the whispers were strongest, where the voices of the past seemed to speak directly to his scholarly soul. As he approached, the shadows coalesced into the form of a massive tome, its pages turning of their own accord to reveal text written in flowing High Valyrian script. But this was not like the texts he had studied in the archives above. These words were alive, shifting and changing as he read them, adapting themselves to his understanding and revealing deeper meanings with each passing moment. "The Chronicle of Binding," he read aloud, his voice trembling with awe. "The true history of how dragon lords bound their souls to their great steeds, and how that binding shaped the very nature of magic itself." The words on the page told a story that had never been recorded in any earthly book, a tale of the first compact between human will and draconic power. It spoke of trials and tests, of souls that were found worthy of the fire and others that were consumed by it. But most importantly, it revealed the truth about the nature of that binding, the way it created connections that transcended individual identity and allowed for the sharing of consciousness across vast distances. Septa Eliana had discovered something equally profound at the chamber's heart, where a pool of what looked like liquid starlight reflected images that showed not the past but possibilities yet to come. In its depths, she saw the 3 marriages of Aegon, not as isolated events, but as part of a grand pattern that stretched back to the very founding of Valyria and forward to a future shrouded in ice and shadow. "The marriages were not the beginning," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "They were a culmination, the final act in a drama that had been playing out for millennia. Look here, in the pool's depths. See how the threads of destiny converge upon a single point in time, a moment when 3 souls would choose to sacrifice their individual identities for the sake of something far greater." The images in the pool showed the true scope of the conspiracy, for lack of a better word, that had brought Aegon and his sister wives together. It was not the work of mortal minds, but of forces that operated on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. Ancient prophecies had spoken of a time when ice and fire would clash in a final battle for the fate of the world, and the marriages were designed to create champions who could stand against the darkness when it came. But the pool revealed something else as well, something that chilled the blood and stole the breath from their lungs. The 3 marriages had been successful beyond measure, creating a bond between the participants that transcended death itself. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys were not gone, not truly. They lived on in the bloodline they had created, their consciousness distributed among their descendants like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Sir Daemon had found his own revelation in a section of the chamber where weapons of incredible craftsmanship hung suspended in pillars of crystallized flame. These were not ordinary swords and spears, but artifacts that had been forged in the heart of dragons, their metal infused with the very essence of fire and magic. As he approached them, he could feel their power calling to the hidden bloodline that ran in his veins, the royal heritage that marked him as one of the lost children of old Valyria. "They're singing," he said in amazement, his voice barely audible above the whispers that filled the chamber. The weapons, they're singing the same song we heard from the broken dragon egg. It's a lament, a mourning song for something that was lost when the doom came to Valyria. The song that emanated from the weapons was indeed filled with sorrow, but it was not the sorrow of ending but of separation. It spoke of connections that had been severed, of bonds that had been stretched across vast distances until they snapped like overtaxed rope. The weapons remembered the touch of their true masters, the dragon lords who had wielded them in the days when magic flowed through the world like water through a riverbed. They longed for that connection to be restored, for the bloodlines to remember their true heritage and reclaim the power that was their birthright. As the three explored the chamber, they began to understand that their quest for truth was not merely an academic exercise, but a vital necessity. The world was changing, the wheel of time turning toward another confrontation between ice and fire, and the knowledge they sought was not just historical curiosity, but practical wisdom that might mean the difference between survival and extinction. The whispers in the chamber grew stronger as night fell outside, their words becoming clearer and more urgent. They spoke of signs and portents, of winter roses blooming out of season, and of dragons being born from stone. They warned of a darkness that would rise in the far north, a cold that would make the long night of legend seem like a brief autumn frost. And they promised that when that darkness came, the bloodline of the three marriages would be the world's only hope. But with that promise came a warning as well. The power that had been bound into the Targaryen bloodline was not without cost. Each generation paid a price for the magic that flowed in their veins, a price that was measured not in gold or lands but in sanity and soul. The madness that plagued the Dragon Kings was not a flaw in their bloodline, but a side effect of the very power that made them capable of standing against forces that would destroy ordinary mortals. As they stood in the Vault of Echoes, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of millennia, the three seekers began to understand the true scope of what they had undertaken. They were not just uncovering the history of three marriages, but unraveling the secret history of the world itself, revealing the hidden connections that bound together magic and reality, love and destiny, mortal will and immortal purpose. The chamber around them pulsed with power that was almost overwhelming, and they could feel their own small flames being drawn into something far greater than themselves. The quest for truth was becoming something more, a transformation that would leave them forever changed and forever bound to the great pattern that wove through all things. In the distance, beyond the walls of Dragonstone and the narrow sea that separated them from the mainland, they could sense the stirring of ancient forces. The wheel was turning, the cycle was beginning anew, and the choices made 3 centuries ago by 3 souls who dared to love beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding were about to bear their ultimate fruit. The night had deepened around Dragonstone. When they emerged from the Vault of Echoes, their minds reeling with revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. But their journey into the hidden heart of Targaryen history was far from over. Septa Ileana led them through passages that seemed to exist outside the normal geometry of the castle, corridors that bent and twisted in ways that should have been impossible, but felt as natural as breathing to those who carried the blood of old Valyria. They came at last to a chamber that took their breath away with its impossible beauty and terrible purpose. The hall of living memory stretched before them like a cathedral built by gods rather than mortal hands, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness that sparkled with points of light like distant stars. But these were not ordinary stars. They were memories made manifest, each point of light containing the preserved consciousness of a dragon lord from the glory days of Valyria. At the chamber's center stood 3 pedestals of carved dragon bone, and upon each rested an artifact that radiated power like heat from a forge. The first held a crown of black iron wreathed in flames that cast no shadow. The second bore a sword, whose blade seemed to be forged from crystallized moonlight, and the third supported a sphere of what looked like captured starlight, that pulsed with the rhythm of a great heart. "The crown of binding," the keeper whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "The sword of severance, the orb of unity. I thought they were legend, myths created to explain the inexplicable. But here they are, as real as stone and steel." Sir Damon approached the sword with the reverence of a true warrior, confronting a weapon that transcended mere craftsmanship. As he drew near, the blade began to sing with a voice like silver bells and winter wind, and he could feel the weight of its history pressing against his consciousness. This was not just a sword, but an instrument of cosmic purpose, forged in the heart of dragons and tempered in the tears of gods. "It remembers," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "every cut it has made, every bond it has severed, every choice that changed the course of history. I can see them all, stretching back through the centuries, like links in an endless chain." The visions that flowed from the sword showed him the true history of the Targaryen conquest, a history that had been hidden beneath layers of political necessity and public relations. Aegon had not simply decided to conquer Westeros on a whim, or even for the noble purpose of uniting the Seven Kingdoms. He had been compelled by forces far greater than his own ambition, driven by prophecies that spoke of a coming darkness that would require unity to defeat. But the conquest had required sacrifices that went far beyond the blood spilled on battlefields. The Sword of Severance had been used not just against enemies, but against parts of the conquerors themselves, cutting away aspects of their humanity that would have made them unfit for the terrible burden they were assuming. Each marriage had involved a ritual severing, a deliberate amputation of individual identity in service of a greater purpose. Scepter Ileana had moved to the crown of binding, her hands trembling as she reached toward the artifact that seemed to burn with cold fire. The moment her fingers touched the iron, her consciousness was flooded with images and sensations that threatened to overwhelm her mortal mind. She saw the three marriages not as separate ceremonies, but as parts of a single great ritual, each wedding adding another layer to a binding that would endure for centuries. "The crown was never meant for a single head," she gasped, her voice distorted by the visions flowing through her. "It was designed to be shared, to create a connection between three minds that would allow them to think and feel and dream as one being. But the binding came at a cost that none of them fully understood when they agreed to pay it." The images showed her the true nature of that cost. The gradual erosion of individual identity that occurred when three souls were forced to share a single destiny. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys had not simply married each other. They had undergone a mystical fusion that left them forever changed, no longer entirely human but not yet fully divine. They had become something new, something that existed on the boundary between mortal flesh and eternal spirit. The Keeper found himself drawn to the Orb of Unity, the sphere of captured starlight that pulsed with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. As he approached, the orb began to glow brighter, and he could see within its depths the swirling patterns of fate and chance that governed the movement of worlds. Here was the source of the dragon dreams, the wellspring of prophetic vision that had guided the Targaryens through 3 centuries of triumph and tragedy. "It shows the pattern," he said, his voice filled with wonder and growing dread. "The great design that underlies all of history, the web of cause and effect that connects every choice to every consequence. And at the center of it all, the 3 marriages that were meant to create a focal point for the forces of order and chaos." The visions that flowed from the orb revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had brought Aegon to Westeros. It was not a human plot, but a cosmic necessity orchestrated by forces that operated on scales of time and space that dwarfed mortal understanding. The survivors of Valyria had not simply fled the doom. They had been chosen, selected by powers beyond comprehension to carry the seeds of hope to a new world. But the visions also showed them something else, something that filled their hearts with both joy and sorrow. The three marriages had been successful beyond all expectation, creating not just a dynasty but a living reservoir of power that would endure until the end of time. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys lived on not just in the bloodline they had created, but in the very fabric of reality itself, their consciousness woven into the pattern of existence like threads of fire through cloth of shadows. As the three seekers stood in the Hall of Living Memory, each touching one of the great artifacts and experiencing visions that threatened to shatter their understanding of the world, they began to realize that their quest for truth had led them to the edge of a revelation so profound that it would change not just their understanding of history, but their perception of reality itself. The chamber around them responded to their growing awareness, the points of light in the ceiling growing brighter and beginning to move in complex patterns that spelled out messages in the ancient script of old Valyria. The memories of the Dragon Lords were awakening, stirred by the presence of living minds that were capable of understanding the truths they had died to preserve. They knew, Septa said, her voice barely audible above the growing chorus of whispers that filled the hall. The Dragon Lords who built this place, who created these artifacts and bound their memories into the very stones. They knew that someday someone would come seeking the truth about the three marriages. They prepared for this moment, leaving behind everything we would need to understand. The Keeper nodded, his eyes fixed on the swirling patterns within the orb of unity. But understanding comes with responsibility, he said. Knowledge of this magnitude cannot be contained or ignored. Once we have seen the truth, we become part of the pattern ourselves, bound to serve the same purpose that drove Aegon and his wives to sacrifice everything they were for the sake of what they might become. Sir Daemon lifted his hand from the sword of severance, but he could feel its influence still flowing through him, changing him in ways that were both subtle and profound. The question is not whether we can handle the truth, he said grimly. The question is whether the world is ready for it. The forces that created the three marriages are still at work, still weaving their great design. And if the visions I have seen are accurate, their ultimate purpose is about to be tested in ways that will make the original conquest look like a child's game. The artifacts pulsed with renewed energy, as if responding to their words, and the chamber filled with a sound like distant thunder. But this was not the thunder of storm clouds, but the roar of dragons awakening from centuries of slumber, the voices of powers that had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim their place in the world. Outside the castle, the wind that had been building throughout their quest reached a crescendo, carrying with it scents and sounds from distant lands and distant times. Somewhere in the darkness, something vast and ancient was stirring, responding to the awakening of truths that had been hidden for 300 years. The three seekers looked at each other with eyes that had been forever changed by what they had witnessed. They had sought the truth behind three marriages and found instead the secret history of the world itself. They had come as scholars and knights and holy women, but they would leave as something more, servants of a purpose that transcended individual identity and mortal understanding. The Hall of Living Memory fell silent around them, but it was not the silence of ending, but of beginning. The first phase of their quest was complete, but the second phase, the phase in which they would have to decide what to do with the knowledge they had gained, was about to begin, and that decision would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of every living soul in the world they thought they knew. In the deepest hours of the night, when the boundary between dreams and waking grew thin as spider silk, the three seekers found themselves in a place that existed beyond the normal confines of Dragonstone. They had passed through a doorway that appeared only when touched by those who carried the blood of old Valyria, stepping from the Hall of Living Memory into a realm where time moved differently and the laws of mortal existence held no sway. The sanctuary of eternal flame stretched before them like a temple built by gods for the worship of forces too vast for mortal comprehension. The chamber was circular, its walls carved from a single piece of dragonstone that seemed to pulse with inner life. At its center burned a fire that cast no shadows, a flame that had been kindled in the heart of old Valyria and had burned continuously for over 400 years, fed not by wood or oil but by the very essence of magic itself. Around the fire stood 3 figures, translucent as morning mist, but possessed of a presence that filled the chamber with power and purpose. Even without the crowns and royal garments they had worn in life, there was no mistaking them. Aegon the Conqueror stood between his sister wives, his bearing still regal despite the ethereal nature of his form. Visenya appeared as she had in her prime, warrior proud and beautiful as a sword blade in moonlight. And Rhaenys, wise and lovely, seemed to shimmer with an inner light that spoke of mysteries understood and secrets kept. "Welcome," Aegon said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "We have been waiting for you, though we knew not when you would come, or in what forms. The wheel turns, the pattern repeats, and those who seek truth in the service of something greater than themselves inevitably find their way to this place." The keeper fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the presence of those who had passed into legend 3 centuries ago. "My lord," he whispered, "we sought only to understand the truth behind your marriages, to uncover the hidden history that the Maesters have forgotten or ignored." Visenya stepped forward, her form becoming more solid as she focused her will upon the mortal realm. "Truth," she said, and there was both sorrow and steel in her voice. "You think you seek truth, but what you really seek is understanding. Truth is what we lived. Understanding is what you need to survive what is coming." The chamber around them began to change, the walls becoming transparent to reveal vistas that stretched across time and space. They could see the ruins of old Valyria, still smoking from the doom that had consumed the greatest civilization the world had ever known. They could see the icy wastes beyond the wall, where ancient powers stirred in the darkness. And they could see the future, dim and uncertain, where ice and fire would clash in a final battle for the fate of all living things. Rhaenys moved to stand beside the eternal flame, her hand passing through it without harm or heat. "You have discovered pieces of the truth," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of ages. "You know now that our marriages were not born of politics alone, but of prophecy and necessity. You understand that we sacrificed our individual selves to become something greater. But you do not yet comprehend the full scope of what we accomplished or the price that was demanded of us." The flame began to dance higher, and within its depths, images formed and dissolved, like dreams given substance. They saw the 3 marriages not as ceremonies conducted in the sight of men, but as rituals performed in the presence of powers that ruled over the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. Each wedding had been a binding not just between souls, but between different aspects of existence itself. "The marriage between Aegon and myself," Visenya explained, her form flickering like candlelight in a breeze, "was a union of will and strength, of the power to impose order upon chaos through force of arms. It created the foundation upon which all else would be built, the bedrock of absolute authority that would be needed to unite a fractured realm." Images flowed through the flame showing Visenya as she truly was, not just a warrior queen but a living embodiment of martial prowess, elevated to the level of cosmic principle. Her sword, Dark Sister, had been more than steel and spell. It had been an extension of her will, a focus for power that could cut through the very fabric of reality when necessity demanded. Rhaenys gestured, and the flame showed different images, scenes of herself in council chambers and libraries, surrounded by scrolls and books that contained the accumulated wisdom of 40 centuries. "My marriage to Aegon was a union of knowledge and vision, of the power to see the patterns that connect all things and to guide the course of events toward desired outcomes. Without wisdom to direct it, strength becomes mere brutality. Without vision to illuminate it, power becomes mere tyranny." But it was when Aegon himself spoke that the true magnitude of their sacrifice became clear. "The binding between the three of us was greater than the sum of its parts," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We became a single entity operating through three forms, a consciousness that could exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. But to achieve this unity, we had to surrender the very thing that makes mortals what they are. We gave up the right to be ourselves." The images in the flame showed the true cost of their transformation. They had not simply married each other. They had undergone a mystical death and rebirth, emerging as something that was no longer entirely human. Their individual personalities, their private thoughts and secret desires, their very souls had been merged into a collective consciousness that operated according to the needs of destiny, rather than the wants of mortal hearts. Sir Damon found his voice at last, though it trembled with emotion as he spoke. "But surely you found happiness in your union. Surely love sustained you through the trials you faced." The three figures exchanged glances that carried meanings too deep for mortal comprehension. It was Rhaenys who answered, her voice soft with infinite sadness. "Love," she said. "Yes, there was love, but not the love of mortal men and women. Not the passion that burns bright and brief in individual hearts. Ours was the love of forces that operate on cosmic scales, the affection that exists between complementary aspects of universal law. We loved as fire loves air, as earth loves water, as order loves chaos. It was beautiful and terrible and eternal, but it was not human." The flame showed them scenes of the three in their private moments, and what they saw both inspired and horrified them. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys moved together with the coordination of dancers, performing a routine perfected over centuries. But there was something uncanny about their interactions, something that spoke of minds so perfectly synchronized that individual thought had become impossible. "The madness that plagues our bloodline," Aegon continued, his form growing more solid, as if the act of speaking truth gave him greater substance, "is not a flaw or a curse. It is the inevitable result of mortal minds trying to contain immortal consciousness. Each of our descendants carries a fragment of what we became, a shard of cosmic awareness that their human brains were never designed to hold." Septa Eliana understood at last, her eyes wide with the terrible clarity of revelation. "That's why the dragons died," she whispered. "Not because of natural causes or human interference, but because the bloodline forgot its true purpose. The dragons were not just mounts or weapons, they were partners in the great working living focuses for the power that you bound into your descendants." Visenya nodded, her expression grave. "When our children and grandchildren began to think of themselves as ordinary kings and queens rather than guardians of cosmic balance, the connection weakened. The dragons sensed the change and began to withdraw from the world, returning to the realm of pure spirit where they await the time when they will be needed again." The implications were staggering. The Dance of Dragons had not been a simple civil war, but a catastrophic failure of understanding, a moment when the Targaryen bloodline had turned its power against itself rather than preparing for the greater conflict that was approaching. Each dragon that died had taken with it a portion of the world's defenses against the coming darkness. "But the wheel turns," Rhaenys said, hope flickering in her ethereal features. "The pattern repeats, and what was lost can be found again. That is why you are here, why you have been guided to this place and shown these truths. The time of testing approaches, and the world will need champions who understand the true nature of the power they wield." The eternal flame began to dim, and the forms of the three began to fade like mist before the morning sun. But before they departed entirely, Aegon spoke one final time, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and the certainty of destiny fulfilled. "The secret you have uncovered is not just about the past, but about the future. The three marriages were not an ending, but a beginning, the first movement in a symphony that has been playing for centuries and will reach its crescendo in the years to come. The blood of the dragon flows still, And when the final darkness rises, that blood will remember its purpose and fulfill the destiny that we three chose to embrace. As the last echoes of his voice faded into silence, the sanctuary of eternal flame began to dissolve around them, returning them to the ordinary world of stone and steel and mortal concerns. But they were no longer the same people who had begun this quest. They had been touched by forces beyond human understanding, given knowledge that came with responsibilities they were only beginning to comprehend. The truth they had sought lay revealed before them, like a map of territories yet to be explored. The three marriages of Aegon the Conqueror had been the foundation upon which the future of the world would be built, and they now understood their role in the great design that stretched from the ruins of old Valyria to the frozen wastes beyond the wall, and forward into a future where ice and fire would clash in battles that would determine the fate of all living things. Dawn was breaking over Dragonstone as the three seekers emerged from the sanctuary of eternal flame, their souls forever changed by the encounter with the departed spirits of the Conqueror and his sister wives. The ordinary world seemed strange and insubstantial after their journey through realms where time moved differently and truth wore forms that mortal eyes could barely comprehend. Yet they knew their quest was not finished. The revelations they had received were like seeds that needed fertile ground to grow, and that ground could only be found in the wisdom of those who had devoted their lives to understanding the deeper mysteries of existence. The keeper led them to a chamber they had passed many times but never truly noticed, hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall of dragonstone, but which yielded to the touch of those who had been touched by the eternal flame. The archive of whispered truths was smaller than the grand halls they had explored, but it radiated an intimacy and warmth that spoke of countless hours spent in quiet contemplation and scholarly discourse. Here, waiting for them with the patience of those who measure time in decades rather than days, sat the Council of the Knowing. These were the hidden guardians of Targaryen lore, men and women who had spent their lives collecting and preserving the fragments of truth that had survived the fall of old Valyria and the conquest of Westeros. Some bore the silver hair and purple eyes of the Dragon Lords, while others showed the mixed heritage of those who had intermarried with the noble houses of Westeros over the centuries. At their head sat a woman so ancient that her age had become something beyond mere years, her skin like parchment, and her eyes like pools of liquid silver that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. She was known only as the Last Rememberer, and she alone among the living had spoken with those who had actually known Aegon and his wives in the flesh. "Welcome, seekers," she said, her voice carrying the whisper of centuries. "We have felt the stirring in the stones, heard the songs that the dragons sing in their dreams. You have been to the deep places and seen the truths that most would call madness. Now comes the harder task, the burden of understanding what you have witnessed and deciding what must be done with the knowledge you have gained." Septa Ileana approached the ancient woman with reverence, her own understanding of the sacred mysteries seeming small and incomplete in the presence of such accumulated wisdom. "Honored Mother," she said, using the formal address reserved for those who had achieved the highest levels of spiritual understanding, "we have seen visions that defy explanation. The three marriages were not what history records them to be, but we struggle to comprehend the full meaning of what we have learned." The Last Rememberer smiled, and in that expression was both infinite compassion and infinite sadness. "Child," she said gently, "you speak as if there were only one truth to be discovered, one secret to be revealed. But the marriages of Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys were like faceted gems, showing different aspects of truth depending upon the angle from which they are viewed." She gestured to the other members of the council, each of whom began to speak in turn, their voices weaving together to create a tapestry of understanding that revealed the full complexity of what had been accomplished 3 centuries ago. "From the perspective of statecraft," said a man whose bearing marked him as descended from the great houses of Westeros, "the marriages were indeed political necessities. Aegon needed allies, needed to legitimize his rule in the eyes of those he had conquered. The appearance of weakness or uncertainty would have invited rebellion and chaos. From the perspective of military strategy, added a woman whose scars spoke of battles fought with more than words. The marriages created a network of dragon riders whose coordination was absolute. 3 minds thinking as one, 3 dragons moving in perfect harmony, 3 sources of dragon fire that could be directed with surgical precision against any threat. From the perspective of bloodline preservation, continued another council member, the marriages ensured that the unique magical heritage of old Valyria would be strengthened rather than diluted. The children born from these unions carried concentrated essence of Dragonlord blood, making them natural conduits for the powers that their parents had bound into the very fabric of reality. But it was when the last rememberer herself spoke again that the deepest truths began to emerge. All of these perspectives are correct, she said, but they are surface truths, like reflections on the water that show only the sky above while concealing the depths below. The true purpose of the 3 marriages was to create what the ancient texts call the Eternal Watch, a consciousness that would endure beyond mortal death, to guard against threats that operate on scales of time that dwarf human understanding. She rose from her chair with the careful movements of extreme age, walking to a wall where tapestries hung that depicted scenes from the earliest days of Valyrian civilization. With trembling fingers, she traced the images of dragon lords and their steeds, of cities that floated on clouds and towers that reached into the realm of stars. The survivors of the Doom carried with them more than just the knowledge of dragon lore, she explained. They bore the burden of prophecy, visions that showed them a future where ice and fire would clash in battles that would determine whether life itself would endure or perish. They knew that conventional weapons and ordinary courage would not be sufficient to face what was coming. The tapestries began to move under her touch, the woven figures coming to life to act out scenes of cosmic significance. They showed the creation of the first compact between dragon lords and their mighty steeds, the binding of souls that allowed mortal consciousness to merge with draconic wisdom. They revealed the true nature of Valyrian magic, not as mere sorcery, but as a technology of the spirit that could reshape reality at its most fundamental levels. The 3 marriages recreated that primal compact. The last rememberer continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of things that had been hidden for centuries. Aegon became the human anchor, the mortal frame that could contain immortal purpose. Visenya became the sword, the focused will that could cut through the barriers between what is and what must be. And Rhaenys became the mirror, the consciousness that could see across time and space to guide the working toward its intended goal. Sir Daemon listened with growing understanding and growing dread. Then the conquest of Westeros was not the true purpose, he said. It was preparation, a gathering of resources, and establishing of positions for a war that has not yet been fought. The ancient woman nodded approvingly. You begin to see the pattern, she said. The Iron Throne was never meant to be a seat of earthly power, but a focus for energies that transcend the mortal realm. It was forged from 1,000 swords not as a symbol of conquest, but as a reservoir of will and determination, each blade contributing its small portion of human resolve to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The implications were staggering. Every king who had sat at the Iron Throne had been unknowingly serving as a conduit for forces beyond their comprehension, their consciousness temporarily merging with the collective will that Aegon and his wives had bound into the very foundations of their dynasty. The throne's famous ability to cut those who were unworthy was not mere symbolism, but a literal manifestation of its supernatural nature. But the system began to fail, said another council member, a woman whose eyes held the silver sheen of prophetic sight. As the generations passed, the bloodline forgot its true purpose. Kings began to think of themselves as ordinary rulers rather than guardians of cosmic balance. The connection weakened, the binding began to fray, and the dragons sensed the change. The keeper found his voice at last, though it was heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. The Dance of Dragons was not a civil war, but a catastrophic system failure, he said. When the Targaryens turned their power against each other, they severed the very connections that their ancestors had died to create. Yet not all was lost, the last rememberer said, returning to her chair with the satisfaction of a teacher whose students had finally grasped a difficult lesson. The pattern endures, written into the very blood of the Dragon Lords. It sleeps, dormant but not dead, waiting for the time when it will be needed again. She gestured to the walls around them, where new images were appearing in the ancient stones. These showed not the past, but possibilities yet to come, futures where the wheel would turn full circle and the choices made 3 centuries ago would finally bear their ultimate fruit. The time of testing approaches, she continued, her voice taking on the resonance of prophecy. The ice stirs in the far north, and the dead begin to walk again. The old compact must be renewed, the ancient bonds reforged, if the world is to survive what is coming. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. They had come seeking historical truth and found instead a burden of cosmic responsibility. The knowledge they had gained was not an end in itself, but a preparation for trials that would test not just their understanding, but their very souls. As the sun climbed higher outside the windows of Dragonstone, casting long shadows through the chamber, the 3 seekers began to understand that their quest had been more than a search for hidden knowledge. It had been a recruitment, a careful selection process designed to identify those who could be trusted with truths that could reshape the world or destroy it. The wisdom they had gathered was like a sword that could cut both ways, a power that could save the world or damn it, depending upon the wisdom and courage of those who wielded it. And as they sat in the archive of whispered truths, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of ages, they began to prepare themselves for the greater trials that lay ahead. As the day waned toward evening, the Council of the Knowing led the 3 seekers to the highest tower of Dragonstone, a spire that reached so far into the sky that its peak seemed to touch the realm of stars themselves. Here, in the Observatory of Final Truths, the ultimate revelation awaited them. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with windows that looked out in all directions across the narrow sea and the lands beyond. But these were not ordinary windows. They were lenses crafted from dragon glass and crystal, each one attuned to reveal different aspects of reality. At the chamber's center stood an astrolabe of impossible complexity, its rings and gears carved from metals that had no earthly names and set with gems that pulsed with their own inner light. This was the heart of prophecy, the device that the surviving Dragon Lords had used to map the currents of fate and glimpse the patterns that would shape the future of the world. The last rememberer approached the astrolabe with hands that trembled not with age, but with the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Everything you have learned thus far has been preparation for this moment," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "The truth behind the 3 marriages is not just about the past, but about a future that has not yet come to pass, but whose shadow already falls across the present." As her fingers touched the astrolabe's controls, the device began to move with smooth precision, its rings rotating to align themselves with celestial configurations that existed not in the mortal sky, but in the realm of pure possibility. The gems set into its framework began to glow brighter, and suddenly the chamber filled with visions that showed the true scope of the conspiracy that had brought Aegon and his wives together. The images revealed a gathering of the greatest minds and most powerful spirits that had survived the doom of Valyria, a council of the wise that had convened in the shadows of the 14 flames as their civilization crumbled around them. These were not ordinary refugees fleeing destruction, but the inheritors of magical knowledge that stretched back to the very foundations of the world. They had seen the signs, read the prophecies, and understood that Valeria's fall was not an ending, but a transition, a necessary clearing of the ground for something far greater. The doom was not an accident, the last rememberer said, her words falling like stones into still water. It was a sacrifice, a deliberate destruction of the old order to make way for the new. The dragon lords who remained behind chose to die so that their power could be concentrated in those who would carry it forward into the age of ice and fire. The visions showed the truth of those final days, the terrible calculus that had driven the survivors to abandon their homeland and scatter across the known world. They had foreseen the coming of the long night, the return of powers that had slumbered since the dawn of creation. They knew that when those powers awakened, the world would need champions who could stand against darkness itself. Sir Damon stared at the images with growing understanding and horror. The conquest of Westeros was planned from the beginning, he said, not just by Aegon, but by forces that had been preparing for centuries. Every choice, every alliance, every battle was part of a greater design. The astrolabe's revelations confirmed his words, showing how the surviving dragon lords had carefully positioned themselves across the known world, establishing bloodlines and gathering resources in preparation for the final confrontation. Some had gone east to the cities of Slavers Bay, where they would preserve the knowledge of dragon breeding and training. Others had ventured south to the Summer Isles, where they would maintain the secrets of Valyrian steel and dragonfire. And the Targaryens had come west to Dragonstone, where they would forge the weapon that would be needed when the Wheel of Time completed its turn. The three marriages were the culmination of 3 centuries of planning. The last rememberer continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth poured forth like water from a broken dam. Every element was precisely calculated, every participant carefully chosen. Aegon was not just a conqueror, but a vessel, selected for his ability to contain the concentrated essence of Dragon Lord consciousness. Visenya was not just a warrior, but a living sword, forged in the flames of purpose and tempered by sacrifice. And Rhaenys was not just a queen, but a mirror, polished to reflect the will of powers that operate beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The visions in the chamber shifted, showing the true nature of the ritual that had bound the three together. It had not been performed in any earthly temple, but in a space between worlds, a realm where the normal laws of existence held no sway. The participants had not simply exchanged vows, but had undergone a fundamental transformation. Their individual souls merged into a collective consciousness that could operate simultaneously across multiple planes of reality. Septa Ileana watched the images with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the true magnitude of what had been sacrificed for the sake of the greater good. They gave up everything, she whispered. Their humanity, their individuality, their very right to exist as separate beings, all for the sake of a war that would not be fought for centuries. But their sacrifice was not in vain, said another voice, and they turned to see that they were no longer alone in the chamber. 3 figures stood at the chamber's edge, translucent as morning mist, but possessed of a presence that filled the space with power and purpose. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys had come to witness the final revelation, to ensure that the truth was understood in all its terrible completeness. "The wheel turns," Aegon said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The pattern repeats, but each iteration brings new possibilities, new choices that can reshape the very foundations of existence. We chose to become the guardians you see before you, but we were not the only ones called to serve." Visenya stepped forward, her form becoming more solid as she focused her will upon the mortal realm. "Every generation of our bloodline has carried fragments of what we became," she said. "Some have embraced that heritage and found strength in it. Others have been driven mad by consciousness too vast for mortal minds to contain. But all have served the purpose, whether they knew it or not." The astrolabe revealed the truth of her words, showing how the Targaryen dynasty had functioned not as an ordinary royal house, but as a living repository of power and knowledge. Each king and queen had been unknowingly serving as a conduit for forces beyond their comprehension, their consciousness temporarily merging with the collective will that their ancestors had bound into the very foundations of reality. But the greatest revelation was yet to come, Rhaenys said, her voice soft with infinite compassion and infinite sorrow. For the three marriages were not unique events, but echoes of a pattern that stretches back to the very beginning of time. In every age when darkness has threatened to overwhelm the light, champions have risen who were willing to sacrifice their individual selves for the sake of the greater good. The chamber filled with visions of other times and other places, showing heroes from myth and legend who had undergone transformations similar to what Aegon and his wives had experienced. They saw the first compact between humans and dragons, the binding of souls that had created the dragon lords of old Valyria. They witnessed the forging of the first Valyrian steel, metal infused with the essence of dragon fire and human will. And they beheld the creation of the great prophecies, visions of the future that had guided the choices of heroes across the ages. The three hearts, one flame, one throne, the keeper whispered, remembering the words from the very beginning of their quest. It was never just about Aegon and his wives. It was about the eternal pattern, the cycle of sacrifice and renewal that keeps the world in balance. And now that cycle begins anew, Aegon said, his form beginning to fade as the visions in the chamber reached their crescendo. The ice stirs in the far north, and the dead begin to walk again. The time has come for new champions to take up the burden we have carried for 3 centuries. As the three spirits faded from view, the astrolabe began to slow its rotation, its rings settling into a new configuration that revealed one final truth. The bloodline of the dragons had not died out with the fall of the Targaryen dynasty. It lived on in hidden places, carried by those who bore the legacy of old Valyria in their veins, even if they knew nothing of their heritage. The wheel turns, the last rememberer said, her voice carrying the finality of prophecy fulfilled. The pattern repeats, and the choices made 3 centuries ago will soon bear their ultimate fruit. The secret behind Aegon's 3 wives is not just about the past, but about a future where ice and fire will clash in battles that will determine the fate of all living things. As night fell over Dragonstone, the 3 seekers understood that their quest for truth had led them to something far greater than they had ever imagined. They had uncovered not just the hidden history of 3 marriages, but the secret pattern that governed the very nature of existence itself. And with that knowledge came a responsibility that would shape the rest of their lives and echo through generations yet to come. In the quiet hours that followed the ultimate revelation, as the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance and the waves lapped gently against the shores of Dragonstone, the 3 seekers found themselves changed in ways that went far deeper than mere knowledge. They had begun their quest as scholars and knights and holy women, driven by curiosity and the desire to understand hidden truths. They would end it as something far more significant, as guardians of wisdom that could reshape the world and keepers of secrets that connected the distant past to an uncertain future. The last rememberer led them to a chamber they had not seen before, though it lay at the very heart of Dragonstone. The vault of endings and beginnings was smaller than the grand halls they had explored, but it radiated a sense of completion that spoke to the deepest levels of human understanding. Here, the final pieces of the great puzzle would fall into place, and the true purpose of their quest would be revealed. At the chamber's center stood a throne, unlike any they had encountered in their journey through the hidden depths of the ancient fortress. This was not carved from dragon bone or forged from conquered steel, but seemed to have grown from the living rock of Dragonstone itself, its form shaped by forces that operated beyond the realm of mortal craft. Upon its seat rested a crown that gleamed with inner fire, not the crown of binding they had seen before, but something far more profound and terrible. "The throne of truth," the last rememberer said, her voice carrying the reverence of one who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, and upon it, the crown of final understanding. These are not artifacts created by mortal hands, but manifestations of cosmic principle, physical representations of the powers that govern the deepest levels of reality. The keeper approached the throne with steps that seemed to echo in dimensions beyond normal space, his scholarly instincts warring with a growing sense that he was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. "What is its purpose?" he asked. Though part of him already knew the answer would change everything, he thought he understood about the nature of existence itself. "It is the final repository," she replied, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that spanned millennia. "The place where all the wisdom of old Valyria was gathered and preserved, where the consciousness of the greatest dragon lords was bound into forms that could endure until the end of time. But more than that, it is the focal point for the great working that Aegon and his wives began 3 centuries ago." As she spoke, the chamber began to fill with a soft light that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. In that radiance, they could see the true nature of what had been accomplished through the 3 marriages. The binding of Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys had not been an isolated event, but the activation of a vast network of power and consciousness that stretched across the known world and beyond. Septa Ileana felt tears flowing down her cheeks as the full magnitude of the sacrifice became clear to her. "They never truly died," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Their consciousness was preserved, woven into the very fabric of reality itself. Every choice made by their descendants, every victory and defeat, every moment of triumph and tragedy, all of it was guided by their eternal presence." The throne began to pulse with brighter light, and within its radiance, images formed that showed the true scope of the Targaryen legacy. They saw the conquest of Westeros not as a series of battles, but as a careful placement of anchor points, locations where the power of dragons could be focused and directed. They witnessed the construction of the Red Keep, not as a royal residence but as a fortress designed to channel supernatural forces. And they beheld the forging of the Iron Throne not as a symbol of conquest but as the keystone of an arcane working that would protect the realm for centuries to come. But the system was designed to evolve, the last rememberer continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth poured forth like water from a broken dam. Each generation was meant to add its own understanding to the great working, to refine and improve the defenses that their ancestors had established. The dance of dragons, the civil wars, even the madness that plagued certain kings, all of it was part of a larger pattern designed to test and strengthen the bloodline. Sir Daemon found himself drawn to a series of alcoves that lined the chamber's walls, each containing artifacts that told the story of the Targaryen dynasty in ways that no Maester's chronicle ever could. Here was the original marriage cup from which Aegon and his wives had drunk on their wedding day, still glowing with the power of the vows that had been spoken over it. There was the first crown worn by a Targaryen king in Westeros, its surface bearing scratches and dents that spoke of battles fought not just against earthly enemies, but against forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. "The Iron Throne," he said, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. It was never meant to be comfortable or easy to sit upon. It was designed to be a conduit, a channel, through which the consciousness of the king could merge with the collective will of the dragon lords who came before. The last rememberer nodded approvingly. Every cut inflicted by the throne's edges was a reminder of the price of power, a physical manifestation of the spiritual wounds that leadership inevitably brings. Those who were worthy bore those wounds with grace, understanding that their individual suffering was a small price to pay for the protection of the realm. Those who were unworthy were rejected by the throne itself, their consciousness unable to bear the weight of connection to something far greater than themselves. The visions in the chamber shifted, showing them the true history of the kings who had followed Aegon. Each had faced trials and challenges that went far beyond the ordinary concerns of rulership, tests of character and will that determined whether they were fit to serve as channels for the power that flowed through the Iron Throne. Some had succeeded, their reigns marked by prosperity and peace as they learned to work in harmony with the forces they had inherited. Others had failed, their inability to understand their true role leading to chaos and conflict that weakened the very foundations of the realm. The Dance of Dragons was the greatest test, the Keeper said, his voice heavy with understanding. When the bloodline turned against itself, when dragon fought dragon in the skies above King's Landing, the very foundations of the great working were shaken. The consciousness that had been bound into the throne was fractured, divided against itself for the first time in centuries. Yet even that catastrophe served a purpose, the last rememberer replied, her tone carrying both sorrow and hope. For it taught the bloodline the true cost of division, the terrible price that must be paid when individual ambition overrides collective purpose. The dragons died not because they were weak, but because they were no longer needed in their original form. Their essence was absorbed back into the bloodline, concentrated and refined for the trials that lay ahead. The chamber began to resonate with harmonics that seemed to come from the very foundations of Dragonstone itself. And in those vibrations, they could hear the voices of all who had come before. Kings and queens, princes and princesses, dragon lords and their ladies, all adding their own notes to a symphony that had been playing for centuries and would continue long after the last star had burned out in the cold depths of space. The bloodline endures, the last rememberer said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled, hidden perhaps, scattered to the far corners of the world, but not lost. When the final darkness rises, when the ice begins its inexorable march south, the children of the dragon will remember their heritage and take up the burden that their ancestors laid down. As she spoke, the throne of truth began to fade, becoming translucent as morning mist before vanishing entirely. In its place stood something far more profound, a presence that could not be seen with mortal eyes, but could be felt in the deepest chambers of the heart. It was the consciousness of Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys, no longer bound to any physical form, but existing as pure will and purpose, ready to guide and protect their descendants through the trials that lay ahead. The secret behind the three wives is revealed at last, the Keeper said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a scholar who had finally solved the greatest puzzle of his life. It was never about politics or conquest, or even love as mortals understand it. It was about creating a defense against forces that threatened the very existence of life itself, a bastion of hope and courage that could stand against the ultimate darkness. The chamber fell silent around them, but it was not the silence of ending but of completion. They had sought truth and found it, pursued knowledge and discovered wisdom, followed curiosity and arrived at understanding. The quest that had begun with whispered rumors and half-forgotten legends had led them to the very heart of existence itself, revealing secrets that connected the mortal world to realms of power and purpose that stretched beyond the boundaries of space and time. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the ancient windows of Dragonstone, the three seekers knew that their lives would never be the same. They had been entrusted with knowledge that could reshape the world, given understanding that carried with it responsibilities that would echo through generations yet to come. The secret behind Aegon's three wives was no longer hidden, but its revelation was not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter in a story that would determine the fate of every living soul in the world they thought they knew. As the sun climbed higher above the ancient battlements of Dragonstone, casting long shadows that danced like memories across the worn stones, the three seekers found themselves standing once more upon the very battlements where their quest had begun, But they were no longer the same people who had first descended into the hidden depths of the fortress in search of forgotten truths. They had been transformed by their journey, touched by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding, and entrusted with knowledge that connected them to a story far greater than any individual life or ambition. The narrow sea stretched before them in all directions, its waters reflecting the morning light like scattered diamonds across a cloth of deepest blue. In the distance, the mainland of Westeros rose from the waves like a promise of adventures yet to come, but there was no urgency in the sight, no pressing need to rush toward whatever destiny awaited them beyond the horizon. They had learned the value of patience, the wisdom of moving in harmony with forces that operated on scales of time that dwarfed human planning and ambition. Septa Eliana stood at the eastern wall, her face turned toward the rising sun, and in her expression was a peace that came not from the absence of responsibility, but from the acceptance of it. The knowledge she had gained in the depths of the castle had changed her understanding of her own calling, revealing connections between the divine mysteries she had always served and the cosmic forces that governed the movement of worlds. She was no longer simply a keeper of marriage records, but a guardian of truths that could reshape the very foundations of faith itself. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice carrying on the morning breeze. "To see the world as it truly is, to understand the patterns that connect all things, the pain and the joy, the love and the loss, all of it part of something so much larger and more magnificent than any of us could have imagined." Her words seemed to hang in the air like incense, carrying with them the weight of wisdom earned through trial and revelation. In the hidden chambers beneath their feet, the artifacts and archives would continue their eternal vigil, preserving the accumulated knowledge of millennia for those who would come after. But the living truth had been passed on, entrusted to hearts and minds that could carry it forward into an uncertain future. Sir Daemon had found his place at the southern wall, where he could look out across the waters toward the lands he had once called home. The knowledge of his own hidden heritage no longer felt like a burden but like a gift, a connection to something noble and eternal that transcended the circumstances of his birth. He understood now that there were no true bastards among the children of dragons, only those who had forgotten their true nature and those who had remembered it. "The wheel turns," he said, repeating the words that had become like a prayer throughout their quest. "The pattern repeats, but each time it brings new possibilities, new choices that can change the very nature of existence itself. We stand at the turning point, the moment when the past gives way to the future, and anything becomes possible." His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, but there was no tension in the gesture, no readiness for violence or conflict. The blade had been transformed by their journey just as its bearer had been, becoming something more than mere steel and leather. It was a tool of purpose now, an instrument that could serve the cause of light in the battles that lay ahead. The keeper stood at the center of the battlements, his scholarly robes fluttering in the gentle wind that carried the sense of salt and stone, and something indefinable that spoke of magic awakening after long slumber. In his hands he held a simple book, its pages blank, but waiting to be filled with the wisdom he had gained, and the truths he would spend the rest of his life sharing with those who were ready to receive them. "Knowledge is responsibility," he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had looked into the deepest mysteries and emerged transformed. "Truth is burden and blessing both. We have been given something precious beyond measure, and now we must decide how to use it in service of something greater than ourselves." Around them, the ancient stones of Dragonstone seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, as if the very fortress was saying farewell to the seekers who had unlocked its deepest secrets. The dragons carved into every surface appeared almost alive in the shifting light, their stone eyes reflecting depths of wisdom that spanned the ages. This place had been built as more than a fortress or a palace. It had been created as a repository of hope, a bastion where the light of understanding could be preserved against the darkness that periodically threatened to overwhelm the world. In the distance, seabirds wheeled and cried above the waves, their calls carrying messages that spoke of journeys begun and journeys ended, of cycles completed and cycles yet to come. The sound was peaceful rather than harsh, a reminder that life continued in all its myriad forms, each creature playing its part in the vast symphony of existence that the three marriages had been designed to protect and preserve. The last rememberer joined them on the battlements, her ancient form moving with the careful grace of one who carried the weight of centuries but was not burdened by it. In her eyes was the satisfaction of a guardian whose vigil was complete, a keeper of secrets who had finally found worthy inheritors for the wisdom she had preserved. "You understand now why we waited," she said, her voice soft as silk but strong as steel. "Why the truth could not be revealed until the proper time, until the wheel had turned far enough for the pattern to become clear. Some knowledge must be earned through trial and sacrifice, proven worthy through dedication and courage." She gestured toward the horizon, where the morning light was painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to echo the colors of dragonfire. "The time of testing approaches, but not yet. There are years still, perhaps decades, before the final confrontation between ice and fire. Time enough for the bloodline to remember its heritage, for the scattered children of dragons to find each other and reclaim their birthright." The three seekers stood together in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of the journey they had completed and the greater journey that lay ahead. They had come to Dragonstone as individuals driven by curiosity and scholarly ambition. They would leave as something more, as guardians of wisdom that connected the distant past to an uncertain future, as servants of a purpose that transcended individual desire and mortal understanding. Below them, in the chambers and passages they had explored, the artifacts of old Valyria continued their eternal vigil. The crown of binding, the sword of severance, the orb of unity, all of them waiting for the time when they would be needed again. The broken dragon egg that had shown them glimpses of lives unlived pulsed gently in its resting place, a reminder that hope could survive even the most devastating losses. As the morning progressed toward noon, the three began their descent from the battlements, moving with the unhurried pace of those who had learned the value of patience and the wisdom of accepting that some things could not be rushed. Their quest was complete, but their true work was just beginning. The knowledge they had gained would need to be shared, carefully and selectively, with those who could be trusted to use it wisely. The secret behind Aegon's 3 wives was no longer hidden, but its revelation was not an ending, but a transformation. Like the marriages themselves, it had become something larger than the sum of its parts, a truth that connected the mortal world to realms of power and purpose that stretched beyond the boundaries of space and time. As they walked through the halls of Dragonstone one final time, the three felt the presence of those who had come before and those who would come after, an endless chain of consciousness that linked every seeker of truth to every guardian of wisdom. They were no longer alone in their knowledge, but part of something eternal and magnificent, a community of understanding that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The ancient fortress settled into peaceful silence around them, its stones warm with reflected sunlight and its shadows soft with the promise of rest well earned. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of waves against the shore provided a gentle rhythm that spoke of cycles completed and cycles yet to begin, of stories ended and stories yet to be told. And in that peace, in that perfect moment of understanding and acceptance, the true secret was finally revealed. It was not about the past, but about the future. Not about what had been, but about what could be. 3 hearts had become one flame. One flame had lit a throne, and that throne would burn eternal as a beacon of hope in the darkness that would always threaten, but would never ultimately prevail. The quest was complete, but the greater story, the story of ice and fire, and the eternal battle between darkness and light, would continue as long as there were hearts brave enough to love, minds wise enough to understand, and souls strong enough to sacrifice everything for the sake of something greater than themselves.